الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله سبحان الله نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. يا الله يا رب العالمين إنا نتوكل عليك ونعوذ بك أن نضل أو نضل أو أن نزل أو نزل أو أن نظلم أو نظلم أو أن نجهل أو نستجهل أو نستجهل، ونقول يا نور السماوات والأرض اللهم اجعل في قلوبنا نورا، واجعل في ألسننا نورا، واجعل في أسماعنا نورا، واجعل في أبصارنا نورا، واعظم لنا نورا يا رب العالمين. In Surah Al-Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the concept of tamkeen. الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور. Those who, when empowered, when in fact they possess autonomy, self-determination, the ability to direct their own affairs, Allah doesn't tell us to what extent, to what degree, but the context seems to be quite clear. That if you are enabled with any amount of power, any degree of self-determination, any degree of autonomy, any extent to which you are able to decide upon your own affairs and determine your own direction in life, and Allah lays it bare that the remembrance of Allah, salah, being in a vigilant state of prayer, in a vigilant state of remembrance, is critical. Right after salah comes your willingness to sacrifice material things. وآتوا الزكاة. Zakah is whatever you spend to purify yourself and purify your material possessions. The very concept of zakah is that which is given to purify. So prayer, remembrance, and giving. Then we come to the third. أمروا بالمعروف. ونهوا عن المنكر. A continuous action, a vigilant stand in which one advocates, pursues systematically and consistency, is in a state of pursuit of what is good and a state of resistance of what is not good, what is evil. Subhanallah, Allah didn't say, الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة, and for instance, وأقاموا العدل. Allah didn't say those who, when empowered, establish justice. Because people often claim to have achieved justice but fail to do so. What is more critical as a social project, as a political engagement, as a philosophy of life, is the vigilant pursuit of goodness, which encompasses the pursuit of what is just, because justice is good. But there is no point of perfect achievement. The pursuit of goodness, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, by the terms of the very expression, has no end point. There is no point in which you can say, we are done. We in fact have enjoined the good and resisted what's evil, and we've achieved it, and we're done. It is a state of vigilance. It is a dynamic. It is a process. But it is also a dynamic and a process that is impossible unless one is able to identify what is good and identify what is bad. It is premised on first the dynamic of recognition. You must first recognize what is good and recognize what is not good, and then be in a vigilant state of pursuit. Now, there are things that by their very inherent nature are primordial, timeless, good. Justice is always good. Compassion is always good. Truth is always good. Kindness is always good. But wherever these absolute primordial goods exist, the devil is always in the details. The devil is always in the details. The problem is not that human beings fail to understand that justice is good, or that kindness is good, or that truth is good, or that compassion is good. The problem is that when human beings are presented with the evolving context and contingencies of their life, when presented with a particular set of facts and realities, in context, they may fail to indeed faithfully pursue what they know in truth is good. In other words, like the very concept of ma'ruf entails, ma'ruf is what is recognized to be good. ما عرف أنه حسن, what is known in context to be good. In other words, the challenge is that we human beings, while capable of upholding abstractions as ideals, we often undermine these very abstractions and ideals in application, because when presented with a specific context and a specific reality, we fail to pursue the ideal. This is precisely why Allah tells you that what matters is that you organize yourself, you create systems in which you are invested in the pursuit of the truth, in the process itself, so that you never surrender to the fallacy, to the belief that you have achieved goodness and you're done. At the end of Surah Al-Hajj, Allah points our attention to the process of witnessing, as if to remind us that goodness, al-ma'ruf, and munkar, the opposite of goodness, is always a matter of context. In other words, it evolves and mutates and changes. When Allah tells us that the very purpose of tamkeen is for us to be shuhada ala nas, and the Prophet ﷺ would be shahid alayna, that we bear witness for Allah vis-a-vis humanity, while the Prophet ﷺ bears witness for Allah upon us as Muslims. But how can you bear witness upon humanity unless you understand the particulars and the details of the dynamic of human social and political evolution. It is not a matter of abstraction. It is a matter of vigilance in the pursuit of the thing. But in order to create any type of system that is capable of helping human beings, so you see, systems are like cars. It is a structure that is enabled by the human being and driven to achieve certain results. But how can you create a system unless first those who create the system and those who participate in the system have achieved a certain cognitive realization, a certain cognitive consciousness? Put simply, regardless of how good your system is, if the people that create the system, that run the system, that are involved in the system, cognitively have no understanding of the particulars of justice, regardless of how good the system's design is, it is doomed to fail. Regardless of how good your car is, if it is driven by a bad driver, the results are not good. Cognitively, in order to create an ummah that can bear witness, those who constitute the ummah and the systems of the ummah must be themselves of a certain degree of moral and ethical maturity. Because cognition is everything. Take, for example, something that is in the heart of our lived reality. We've spoken at length. We've spoken at length about the sacredness of the space in Mecca. We've spoken at length about how Allah taught us that when it comes to Mecca, that space is bound by special rules that is supposed to demonstrate and uphold the divine ideal. So many lectures and books have been written and can be written about the reality that Mecca is in unclean hands. The hands that control Mecca is impure hands, filthy hands, hands that have been implicated in numerous injustices and numerous corruptions of the sacred space. But yet, so many Muslims, when you come to their cognition, regardless of how much they believe or they say they believe in al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy an al-munkar, will get worked up about whether a certain book of hadith is authentic or not authentic, far more than they will get worked up about anything that happens in Mecca. Will get worked up about whether a woman is wearing hijab or not, far more than they will get worked up about anything that is happening in Mecca. Cognition. What is the worth of these absolute ideals to a psyche that is cognitively skewed, cognitively corrupted, unable to balance between priorities? The same hands that control Mecca, in what is now a well-known story about the Saudi student Salma Shihab. Salma Shihab is doing a doctorate in medicine at the University of Leeds. She is in her final year. She's married. She has 2 children. She goes back to Saudi on her break, expecting to return to the University of Leeds to finish her studies. She is arrested. And because she retweeted certain messages on Twitter about Saudi dissidents, these retweets were considered an act of terrorism. And Salma Shihab was tried in Saudi Arabia as a terrorist. All the charges were disrupting the public peace, spreading false information, etc., etc. And as I'm sure many of you know, she was sentenced to 34 years in prison and 34 years probation afterwards. So she cannot leave Saudi Arabia for 34 years after serving her 34 years. So basically, Salma Shihab's life is over, simply because she retweeted certain things. Now, of course, Salma Shihab is Shi'i. Did this play a role in the egregious sentence that Salma Shihab received? Anyone that knows anything about the human rights practices in Saudi would very strongly suspect that it did play a role. Because for the Saudi government, Shi'is are basically not even human beings. Pause here. another Muslim life, the life of a Muslim woman in this case, is destroyed. You will find plenty of Muslims who will still defend the government of Saudi. Plenty of Muslims who will say, well, why did she retweet messages about Saudi dissidents? Well, if you clash with power, don't whine and complain about what happens to you. Well, if she wanted to finish her education, she should have steered away from all political matters. Well, yes, it might be harsh, but look at all the great things that MBS is doing otherwise. Oh, yeah, well, the life of another female Shi'i person has been destroyed among the thousands of Shia that have been persecuted or executed or thrown in prison or tortured. But, look at all the other things MBS does. Allows women to drive cars. What do you do? Do these people sincerely believe that they are witnessing a social and political order that does what Allah has commanded us to do, to bear witness for al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar? Yeah, their belief could be sincere. Those individuals could sincerely believe that al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar does not preclude the Saudi government from doing what it did to this Shi'i woman. The problem is in the ethical, intuitive virtue. In other words, in the cognition of the individual. A moral person, the ability to be ethically within the context of your historical moment. And our historical moment teaches us that people should not go to prison because they retweet messages, regardless of what these messages are. Our historical moment tells us that it is uncivilized and barbaric, leave alone demonic, to destroy the life of a mother because she cared about what's happening to other persecuted individuals in her country. That is why Allah says, bear witness, i.e., Allah embeds you in the context. If in your historical moment you witness this, and you say, I don't see a problem. If in your historical moment you witness this, and you say, I don't see an inconsistency between Saudi Arabia being the custodian of the two holy sites and what Saudi Arabia does to the Shia minority, you're ill. You might not realize it, but you're actually morally sick. If you look at this situation and you say, I don't see an inconsistency between the destruction of the life of this poor woman, Shi'i or not, And Saudi Arabia being the custodian of the two holy sites, again, you are morally sick. There is no way for Allah to reach you through Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, because the very machinery of your cognitive ability has been infected by the demonic, and you are no longer capable of just judgment. Cognitive abilities, for cognition to be steeped in virtue, but virtue is not about absolutes that don't translate on the ground. Virtue is about achieving just results within context. And when you look around the world and you see anyone that understands anything about human rights, point to a situation like the one we observe with Salma Shihab and say this is repulsive, this is disgusting, this is morally unacceptable. If you are an honest witness, you would check your cognitive processes and you would carefully consider the fact that so many reasonable people in your universe are offended by what is offensive. If you go ignore all of that and go on your merry way, then you have failed to understand Allah's command and Allah's teachings about التمكين في الأرض, about الأمر بالمعروف, and about bearing witness. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم اسألوا الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Moral cognition. Moral cognition and moral perceptions, unfortunately, can be so easily manipulated and so easily skewed, deformed. Moral judgment, conscientious moral judgment, is truly, as Allah describes it in Surah Al-Hajj, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ. A true state of jihad, a true state of perseverance, insight, and hard work and learning. Let me give you a very different example. Recently, a man, I don't know anything about this man, whether he's demented, disturbed, crazy, fanatic, stabbed the writer, the author Salman Rushdie. And of course, because Salman Rushdie was stabbed by this man, immediately the issue of the fatwa that was issued against Salman Rushdie decades ago, calling for his death because of his novel, The Satanic Verses, came back to life. Again, I don't know anything about this man, and I don't know if he was in fact influenced at all by the books, The Satanic Verses, or if he had a personal vendetta, or he might have been just a demented human being. But what caught my attention is some Muslims, and especially a comment by one Muslim who said, all the stuff that Muslims talk about al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, all the stuff, and then the hypocrisy of us stabbing this man. What caught my attention was the amount of young Muslims, most of them perceiving themselves as intellectuals of some sort. Most of them graduate students who are working on their doctorates in sociology or history or anthropology or Islamic studies or Near Eastern studies, who perceive themselves as the intelligentsia. And what they were engaging in was self-flagellating narratives about how this stabbing proves that Muslims, their ummah, their own people, are incapable of understanding basic decency and basic concepts about freedom of speech, and that this proves why democracy and rights and liberty would never work in the Muslim world. Because look, and as I read this commentary, it just so happened that minutes before reading this miserable commentary by these miserable pseudo-intellectuals, the Muslim professors of tomorrow, I had just read a news item about Israeli forces shooting yet another Palestinian in East Jerusalem, a 21-year-old who was shot point blank in the head and killed. No explanation. His family says he was a student not involved with anything. And as usual, no one cares, no one stops, no one pauses. Just before killing yet another Palestinian, shooting that Palestinian point blank, Israel had stormed, searched, and closed down 6 human rights Palestinian organizations, like this organization known as Al-Haq, for instance. All 6 are respectable human rights organizations that trace and document human rights abuses committed by Israeli authorities and by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Israel, as part of a long ongoing legal battle, has used its exceptional military order laws to shut down all 6 organizations claiming that they're terrorist organizations, despite the fact that all they do is witness and testify. I scoured Israeli media afterwards and only found one article in Haaretz that was mildly critical of what Israel done. It basically said these organizations have long record of human rights work. We should be more careful before we just call everyone a terrorist and close them down. But otherwise, Israeli society saw no endemic ailments in the consciousness of the collective Israelites or in Jewish culture and tradition, even when it is institutions that commit the murder, and even when it is institutions that close down these human rights organizations. Put differently, if that society had the same type of disease that the Muslim intelligentsia has, they would have looked at the fact that Israel closed down 6 human rights organizations as evidence that the Jewish tradition is flawed, and that the Jewish tradition is despotic and authoritarian, and that the Jewish tradition doesn't have the ability to understand human rights work, and that the Jewish tradition is fundamentally flawed, etc., etc., etc. It is not about the Jewish tradition, as it is not about the Islamic tradition. It is about justice in context, justice in the historical moment as you live it. It is about your ability to bear witness in fairness and in balance. It is about your ability to condemn the stabbing of Salman Rushdie as a criminal, disgusting act without slandering the entire Muslim tradition or Muslims in general. It is about your ability to condemn Israeli authoritarianism and Israeli despotism and Israeli racism without slandering the entire Jewish tradition, which no one does anyway. It is not about those who think that bearing witness is ultimately rendering testimony that furthers empower the already powerful. But it is about bearing witness in support of the truth, even when the cost of that testimony is to threaten the powerful. That is the hardest thing. To stand by Salma Shihab, even when you know that this is going to piss off Saudi authorities. To bear witness as to what the sacred space in Mecca deserves even when you know the cost, that puts you in direct confrontation with those who are powerful. To bear witness about Israeli colonialism and racism and injustice, even when it pits you against the powerful organizations that support Israel, right or wrong. That is what al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy anil munkar is all about. It is not about petty things. It is not about things that don't cost. Testimony that doesn't cost the witness is hardly worth testifying to. Testimony really matters when it really costs to witness truthfully and honestly. I will give one final example. An example of how skewed cognition and moral insight can become. Recently, we again revisited the 9th anniversary of the massacre committed by the military in Egypt, in which, in the course of a couple of days, at least, and that's a low number, 3,200 unarmed civilians were massacred in Rabaa by the Egyptian military. Despite the fact that the Egyptian military, the massacre was well documented by numerous cameras, and that 3,200 people were slaughtered, and many of the bodies burned or thrown in the Nile. The people responsible for this massacre, including Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, live with complete impunity. They visit the West. They're treated as a great leader. Trump even praised Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, calling him a killer and his favorite dictator. Biden didn't impose any type of accountability upon Sisi and his government. Sisi and his people, although having massacred over 3,000 people, well documented, continue to travel around the world and be treated as VIPs. This, at the same time that these same governments who give this red carpet treatment to Sisi continue to spew rhetoric about how they believe in human rights and how Muslims have a democracy deficiency, etc., etc., etc. But what is especially troubling is that you will find tons of Egyptians who say they believe in God, who pray, who fast Ramadan, who will go to Hajj, who will do all of these things, but are amazingly, blissfully not bothered by the massacre of over 3,000 Egyptians, documented by numerous cameras. You could go on YouTube and you can watch the massacre. You will find tons of Egyptians who are regular mosque goers and are blissfully not troubled by it at all. And when you say anything to them, they have one word, one response. Well, they were Muslim Brotherhood. As if Allah has said, honor life unless it is the life of a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. As I'm sure, as most of you know, this is the reason I was banned from the Islamic Center of Southern California. You have an entire Islamic center with tons of people who claim that all they do is work for Islam in America, but who do not believe that part of their Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar obligation, or part of their obligation to bear witness or shahada, is to condemn in any way the massacre of over 3,000 people. Many of them were children and women. And the near 100,000 political prisoners in Egyptian prisons are being tortured. Many of these people I know personally. They truly believe they are pious. They do their prayers. They fast. They even do azkar. They even pray extra prayers, sunnah. But they see nothing morally wrong in the Egyptian government massacring over 3,000 people, unarmed, even if they were armed. You know, because a lot of times they tell you, oh, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, there was 1 or 2 guns discovered in the massacre. You know, anyway. Those who are morally sick, these people have a moral illness that make them impenetrable to the message of the Quran. When you tell them that your prayer is not accepted, your fasting is invalid, because you are an unjust human being who has failed in the main charge and task of tamkeen fil ard. You bear witness for the devil, not for Allah. When you tell them that, they have no means of comprehending or even understanding what you're talking about. Just like the Israelis, who can continue murdering Palestinians and think they're hardly murdering human beings, or can shut down human rights organizations and still say we have the only democracy in the Middle East. Just like the Saudis, who can see a student jailed for 34 years for retweeting messages and see no inconsistency between this and being a custodian of the sacred space of Mecca. Moral illness is moral illness. It is like a satanic virus. It blinds people to justice in context, justice in application. While these people can understand justice in the absolute and even praise it in the absolute, they are too blinded by power, by privilege, by advantage. They are in fact Hizb al-Shaitan, not Hizbullah, the party of Satan, not the party of God. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إني داع فأمنوا. اللهم اغفر لنا، اللهم ارحمنا يا علي عظيم، اللهم اهدنا الصراط المستقيم، اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي عظيم. Allah forgive our sins. Guide us to the straight path. Guide us so that we can be honest and truthful Muslims bearing witness on your behalf for justice, for ma'roof, against munkar. Ya Ali ya Azim, Ya Rabb al-Alameen. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وأقم الصلاة.